Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. My name is Barney, and I'm getting us started off today. And my two co-hosts that are joining me here today are going to be...
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Ken. Glad to be here.
Good morning, everyone. I am Jacob.
And we want to welcome you to another episode where we will look into an episode of Northern Exposure. And today we thought we would jump ahead quite a bit and see what season 6, episode 4 has in store for us. In one of the books that was written by Darren Burroughs, who plays Ed, he said how he was having a chat with his fellow actor, Barry Corbin, who plays Maurice. And Maurice was saying how, their responsibility as actors is to, give it their best, put what they would into each episode to make it real good quality, even if maybe the writing wasn't what they thought that it had been in the past, that they had a responsibility to put their best foot forward every single time. And season 6 does have some hit and miss episodes, but this one has a lot of 3 really good stories that work well together and each kind of teach us something about ourselves that we could look at from how each unfolds. And I think there's a lot of good that happened in this episode. So I think we should get started. I think the 3 main storylines are Maggie uncovering a letter that she wrote to herself when she was younger, and Shelley having a chain letter, which I don't know how many of our audience can relate to. And then Joel, and also kind of Joel and Chris and a new barber that comes to town. There's 3 stories kind of intertwine a little bit, and then kind of Joel gets a little bit more of the play. But the barber and Chris have a really interesting dynamic going on too. So what do you guys think? I mean, the letter one has a lot. Maggie's letter has a lot into it, but where do you think we should get started today?
Well, first I want to say, Barney, I love your intro as far as those people who have seen the series. Season 6 does have those hit and miss moments. Certainly, there was conflict behind the scenes, etc. Which again, and we've said this before, makes it all the more interesting that Jacob is going through this experience for the first time, and the curiosity of how he felt about an episode now in the very last season. And that's kind of an aside. The letter thing, I Barton, you called it before we went live this morning. It's such an interesting cold opening where Maggie's 15-year-old counterpart, a wonderful actress who I don't know who she is or what she's done, plays the part of that 15-year-old. And eventually the letter gets to Maggie. Her father finds it in when he was looking through his collection of National Geographics and sends it to her. And the emotion and the reaction that she experiences going through that. Jacob, how did you feel when you first saw this unfolding?
Well, I love the premise of a younger version of a character's talking to an older version. And I think we had seen that before with Shelley when she had the vision of her daughter, at different ages. And obviously, it wasn't herself, but it was her, like another character spaced out at different intervals. And I think it's a wonderful storytelling device because it shows how like time and the season of life we're in really shapes our priorities and shapes how we think and how we grow. And so, in that earlier episode, Shelley sees her daughter growing and progressing and having the experiences of a young adult versus a young child. And in this case, Maggie herself growing and seeing the differences between a 15-year-old version of herself and her 30-year-old or more version of herself and the priorities that she has later in life and maybe how she hasn't lived up to what she had thought previously. And so I loved it. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting and engaging. It drew me in. I kept wondering, Northern Exposure has this wonderful way of walking the thin line between reality and kind of, I don't know if you want to call it
Mm.
hallucination
Hallucinogenic.
or supernatural
Mhm.
experience,
Mhm.
and the only character in the whole episode that seems to acknowledge that this is happening to Maggie is Ed, who perceives that she's engaged with some type of interaction with some other non-corporeal phantasm or being. I
Uh-huh.
forget what he
Uh-huh.
calls that. He's like, you probably don't want me inserting myself now while you're interacting with your. I forget what he called. Do you know what the words were that he used? But he senses
First,
some. What
he
is it?
said it was sort of a luminous
Yeah,
egg,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
a luminous
Mhm.
egg.
Mhm.
That's right.
and then he said, "Engaging with your manifestation."
Right. Exactly. So, so you
Perfect.
know, I mean that. Like in Northern Exposure fashion, it's like, okay, is this, because Northern Exposure delves into psychology, through Chris's, radio segments, and then it delves into the spirituality of different angles, and so it's like, what is exactly going on for her? And so it's kind of a wink from the show, like there is more going on here than it might seem, but I love that she has that engagement with your younger self. And then I know, not to spoil anything, but at the end of the episode, then she sets to write another letter to her older
Mm.
self that someday the older version of herself would read. And it's that kind of recognition, I think, by that point that the to be in touch with one's former place in life where you are now is healthy and that there can be an integrity. Not that we agree with all the things we thought when we were young, but that we remember it in light of where we are now, and then we realize in the future we're gonna grow too, and so she dares to write a letter to her future self, like, in my view, kind of in the hope that that too would be beneficial in that season, that to have that type of continuity throughout our life, to know who we were, who we are now, who we're becoming is worth the I don't know, the challenge or the disappointment with some things, but also the empowerment with others when we realize, "Oh, maybe I can do more," or being in touch with some things I thought back then that spur me on now to do a little bit more than I am doing, or maybe in the future, I'll glean even more inspiration. So, yeah, I love that. So what do you guys think? I mean, if you can kind of put yourself in that place of going back and seeing it for the first time, if you kinda remember your earlier thoughts, or maybe upon viewing it again for this time, what did you think of it as a device or as a part of the story? Maggie reading a letter from her younger self.
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think it it's not such an uncommon thing that I think of this exercise of writing a letter to your future self and then hopefully, having it sent or discovering it later. I feel like it's kind of something that like you hear people suggesting that they do to that their kids do or that they have done themselves. Like it's not such an uncommon thing. That just as a little aside, there was a Japanese singer and songwriter who she did the same thing when she was 15, and her mother sent the letter on to her, and she turned the letter, part of the letter, into a song, and then the other half of the song is her writing a letter back to her 15-year-old self, and it's called tegami, which means letter in Japanese, and I recommend. I think it's Angela Aki is her name. She's a biracial, even in fact, and I recommend checking it out. Even if you can't necessarily understand the lyrics, it's just a beautiful song in general. But when I saw the episode the first time, I think I was just really interested in what might happen, and then I was surprised by 15-year-old Maggie showing up in Maggie's house and the path that took. But just like Jacob said, this is really quintessential. This is, true to form for Northern exposure. And the way that it's done is so great. It doesn't seem like it seems just really natural and really the way that the whole episode comes together like this. It doesn't feel weird the way that they do it. It really feels like this is the way the episode's going.
Mhm.
But then when I think about the episode, when I think about this now, I think that we really, after seeing it a few times, and then myself, I guess all of us being beyond the 30s and into the 40s, and the halfway through 40s and more, we can kind of look at what it might have been like as a 30-year-old self, and that's tricky to read a letter from your 15-year-old self because at 30 we don't have a lot of wisdom yet. And I think if I had done this, I would maybe have to have trouble taking a step back to read this letter. I think I'd be really dreading, what is it that 15-year-old Barney had wanted to do, and then now what is 30-year-old Barney really doing? And I don't want to have disappointed myself. And I know that I'm probably not where I should be, but when you look at it from 45-year-old or more Barney looking at that, then yeah, you can see that this is kind of just the way Jacob put it. Like this is a progression of just stages that we go through in life. And if you can have enough distance when you are 30 and read that letter from a 15-year-old self, then it would be such a real treasure, a real gift. But then the neat thing about the episode is we can see a real 30-year-old, Maggie. I think that the actor does a great job portraying what a 30-year-old probably would have gone through, wrestled through in reading this letter and trying to come to terms with where she is now. And then, you know, understanding that this is the life that she willingly chose to be a bush pilot in Alaska. But then finally, the neat thing is how she takes it as motivation to even add a little bit more to her life and where she might want to try going in the next 15 years. So that was pretty, very, very, very deep, I think, the way that they did this story, and really fun to see and think about, especially now that the three of us are where we are in our lives.
Sure. Yeah, I love your perspective, Barney. I think that really helps to explain why Maggie was a great choice to do this with. It would have been fascinating to take Chris and have him be that guy. I think the potential for humor would have been higher because, Chris at 15 years old was probably contemplating his third or fourth crime and, had been perhaps removed periodically from his West Virginia high school. And Maurice, who probably had big dream, but given Maggie's character, they were so consistent about it, and like you said, she is that 30-year-old now, and it just gave such a rich characterization of the whole idea. I loved it. Loved it. Yep.
And before we started recording today, you had sent out a few questions related to this idea of the letter. And I was wondering what drew you to kind of look reflectively about the concept of the letter for our lives today. I noticed, like, could you say a little bit about the questions you drafted and the idea behind some of them?
Sure, and it's a little more difficult to, as people, beyond 30 years old to go back and kind of predict what you might have said as a 15-year-old, but there's a fun element to it too. As I thought back, and contrasting with Maggie's life, growing up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, in a life of privilege and tennis lessons and huge expectations. I think as I would write the letter as a 15-year-old, in a family where my father did graduate from college. No one else, in the near family did. I don't think I would be predicting an occupation even. I think I would be thinking things like, "Gee, am I still living in the Youngstown, Ohio area? Gee, I wonder what kind of car I might be driving." You know, the depth would not be there, certainly. I wonder if I'm married. I wonder if 'Cause I don't know what I don't think I was thinking occupationally. I think I would be saying, "I wonder what college I graduated from," because it felt like at 15, I was young in my class. I was already a sophomore. That was probably part of the plan in my head. What about you guys? How kinda reflections might come to mind?
That's interesting how you mention a really important point, I think, about Maggie and her background. I think that her father was like the CEO of GM or something like that, and how when you come from have so many more opportunities available to you from such a young age, then a lot more is expected out of you. And so that was, I can think we can see that really in her letter of where she thought that she would be. And then as I try to think of probably how I was thinking and feeling and acting and doing at 15, I think I think that's an age where like you really focus on what is it that at that time would have made you happiest, and so I probably would have thought, what kind of person are you married to, and what are you doing with your life and your, free time. Certainly you must be like traveling and doing things like that and, having a career that would enable such a nice, you know, a lifestyle with so much leisure involved, I think is probably what I would have been thinking. But yeah, I think that also at 15, like everything is so possible. Like you dream, you can easily dream the biggest dreams because you feel like you could do anything. It's somehow or another things will work out. Maybe with a little bit of luck and a little bit of hard work, you feel like you could probably do anything. And so I think that probably a lot of letters from 15-year-olds would be full of really, really grand ideas with lots of accolades. I don't know, but I can think that that might be something that I would have hoped for myself. I think that I remember writing a lot of stories in 7th and 8th grade English where I imagined myself, being like the team doctor for a hockey team, something like that. And, that would have
Mm.
been, boy, the pinnacle of life could never get any better than that. So I don't know if I would have been a little bit more realistic a few years later, but boy, when I remember 7th, 8th grade, that was my dream.
Wow.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I liked how you both looked at it from different perspectives. And as you were talking, maybe if I could just reflect briefly on what you said, Barney, about Maggie piggybacking of Ken's comment that she came from this position of affluence, that there were these expectations that her life would follow a similar path and she would be a lawyer and have a career that would she would earn a large income and have lots of social capital. But my question, as I think about that, is like, there had to have been a logic for why she went the way that she did. And maybe as she got older, she realized she didn't need that stuff and she wanted more room to breathe and be herself and go down a path where the pressure was, I don't know, just released and that she had her own autonomy. And I don't, to some extent, she seems kind of like a free spirit on some level. And so I feel like her adult self kind of her answer to how she was raised was to pick a different path, not out of failure, but out of like intentionally wanting to live differently. Like she doesn't strike me as somebody who needs to have a fancy house and a fancy car, and
Mm.
like she's kind of set aside that framework and has picked another one and sees value in it. So it's like a different value system, and that's natural as people grow older and
Mm.
they make their own life decisions. They kind of develop their own life philosophy, and so she just has happened to have moved out of maybe the prom primary one that she had in her youth. But anyway, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's just like what I was thinking based off of your comments, that there had been a shift and that it was logical and it was not just driven by failure, that it was driven by seeing inherent value in a different way. But anyway, I love this question about how we would connect with the thoughts of our younger self and what the expectations of our younger self would be for who we are now. And I think you're right, Barney, that a lot of the things at 15 that we think about are related to our interests and what brings us joy, and we tend to project that into the future. Like for me, I was really into music at the time, so I probably would have thought like, oh, in 15 years, like what will I be doing in terms of playing guitar and singing? And 15 years from now, I was really plugged in to like the church and my local youth group, and I probably would have thought, well, 15 years from now, you'll be doing something with ministry in some form. You know, I didn't know that I'd be a pastor, but like I did have some expectation that would be part of my life. But some of us, I think, have a little bit less capacity to imagine the future, or maybe are more oriented more in the present. Like that's how it was for me. Like I had a very hard time, and I still do, thinking far out. And I know some people who are very good at visioning and imagining like, oh, when I achieve this, I'll do that. And when I
Mm.
can just almost see it. And in my mind, it's almost like enshrouded in like clouds. Like I have a friend of mine who will talk about his plans. He almost thinks in terms of like 5 or 10 year plans. And he'll be talking about like this or that and the technical things. And I'm like, I just can't think. It's very hard for me to think that way. And so as a 15-year-old, I didn't have a lot of clarity about, what I would be doing as a career, where I'd be living. I had no idea that 15 years from then I would be married and that I would be having children, that I would be doing the things I'm doing. But I do feel that over the years, I'm a very nostalgic person. And I think it's because I value the idea of like a connection with my past. And And I think to some extent, and I don't know if this is true for everybody, but like the struggles I had or the challenges I faced, I'm still kind of I'm working through them in light of where I am now. And so a lot of times I'll go back and remember them in light of how things turned out, and that's helpful for me. And so it's kind of like a type of therapeutic remembering or like working through. But then on the flip side, there were lots of things that I enjoyed that were unique to that season that like my parents were living then, and they've gone on now. I mean, they're living now in the eternal
Mhm.
sense with the Lord, but they're not
Mhm.
here with us on the earth. And so my remembering now is also, it's therapeutic, but it's also celebratory. It brings me delight to think back on some of those memories. But I think in a way, even though I many of us don't have a letter that we wrote to ourselves, there are other vehicles with which we access like the thoughts or the ideas or memories of our younger selves. Like, for example, when I was in college, I started this probably when I was about 18. I wrote journals throughout my college years. And so when I go back and read those journals, it gives me a window into my younger self. The other day, our third child, Hannah, was baptized. And I it made me think back on my own experience, and I got the photo out of what I have a photo of when I was baptized, and I went back and I was through the photo, I was remembering aspects of the day and the people, and so photos are another vehicle that take us back. And then, like, wasn't it the case, I thought you told me not too long ago, you found a hard drive that had a bunch of old files and stuff that you had, is that right? And
Mhm.
that's kind of like a digital
Mhm.
window, you know? So I guess my question is like, do you guys sense that you revisit your past, even if it's not a letter you wrote yourself, but you find in other ways to get in touch with maybe the experiences you had as a younger person, and it does inform to some extent. It is helpful. for the person we are now. At least for me, can bring clarity and like sometimes refocus myself. And so, what do you think?
Yeah, when you were mentioning that, I thought about a live journal account that I had that I can still log into it, and then thinking about it, and it's how can it be 20 years old by now already? And and then sometimes I go back and read the things that I wrote, but you always have to give yourself grace when you do that because it's you have to remember to look at yourself then, the way you were thinking 20 years ago, because if you evaluate yourself 20 years your 20 years ago self with what you know now, it's there's a little bit propensity to be a little bit too harsh on yourself, because of all that you've learned in the meantime. And then you think, boy, how could I have, thought those things? How could I have been that way, and things like that. But then, giving yourself the grace to think, yeah, that would be how a lot of people might have been and might have been thinking and writing and saying. And, and then you just kind of wish that you knew then what you did now, right? But to kind of talk a little bit about what you were saying, Jacob, I have a few things I want to pick up, but one thing is, I wonder if, and then you can comment on this if you want or not, but or just leave it as my kind of observation or pondering. If maybe you see when you think about the future, it seems a little bit unclear to you. If that is like a way that you are intentionally leaving space for God to act, as in like not trying to make plans, but leaving room for how you might be guided or how, God would be wanting you to go. And then so not being, not having such a concrete path set ahead so that there is room for, the way that the God has the world moving around us to interact and impact the decisions that you make. I don't know. That was
Hmm.
just something that I thought might be, but
That's a really
Well,
interesting point, Barney. I haven't thought of that before. Maybe the spirituality that was surrounding me when I was growing up had such a focus on living in the present moment or the not skipping ahead to the next day that I kind of was trained not to like let my mind wander in that way. Maybe that's
Mhm.
that's an interesting thought. I
Yeah.
I hadn't considered that
I
before.
Barney, I think it's a wonderful thought and a wonderful segue into Shelley and the Chain Letters because, as you guys will recall, I'd love the conversation later in the show in the brick between Shelley and Walt, where, Walt was the perfect character to have this
oh yeah,
conversation. He's talking about Calvin and predestination and Shelley just sitting and God's already decided, what's going to happen, and whatever you do doesn't matter. And Shelley's still sort of malleable, and then he goes, but yet, there's like a William Jennings Bryan who says, accept the Bible literally. Evolution is a no-no, but there is free will. It's just another one of those moments in Northern Exposure where
mm,
it goes beyond just a surface conversation, and Shelley had so lamented over these chain letters, and then came to find out that they were never sent even when
yeah.
her and Ed are out in the, garbage dump, and they find the original, and it wasn't sent, so, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ken. So in Shelley's story, the chain letter is a way of thinking about how do we say it? Like, is it kind of like fate, luck,
Mm.
good fortune, misfortune? How she receives this chain letter that tells her if you send it on to others, you'll find good fortune, but if you don't, watch out. And so she thinks it's silly and crumbles it up and discards it, and then is having all these terrible experiences. Then she finds it and thinks she sends out the letters, but has inadequate postage, so they never go out. But then the fact that she thinks that they've gone out, she's like in a better mental place, and so she's thinking, "Oh, I'm having good fortune." But then she questions when she finds out that they weren't sent out, was any of it really meaningful at all whatsoever? Do we control anything? Is it all just fate? And it's these are like huge philosophical questions. And I
I
love how
know.
the show does that. It's like it'll ask anything from the, core of human experience over the years, and frame it in such a thoughtful way. So, and it doesn't push us to pick one conclusion, but it generally brings the characters through the action of questioning, though, to a place where they feel some level of resolution, I think, by the end of their journey each episode. So I felt like she did feel finally a sense of relief in stepping out and daring to adventure and saying, like, well, we don't know the future, but let's dare to try things, like she's going to go to, even though they don't have a hotel reservation, she's still gonna go on this trip because she thinks that they'll find a way. Even if they have to sleep in their vehicle, they'll still make the best of it. And it's kinda like she's not paralyzed anymore by the thought of, like, "Am I fated to do this or that?" It's more just like, "I'm gonna venture to try and step out into life and live and engage even though I don't know the future." And so, which I guess in a way is kind of a nice parallel to Maggie because she's kind of struggling with like, have I failed at what I would thought I should do? And then by the end, she's like, I'll step out in courage into the future. And she writes herself a letter daring to believe like, I'll be ready then when that letter comes. And I don't know, it's like about empowerment, I think. And the show generally, I think, takes a positive spin on the challenging things. I don't know if that's what you guys feel, but I feel like in general, the show tries to move us in a healthier direction and a healthier place. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, I absolutely agree with your final statements. The show does do that. When we I don't know how deeply we're gonna get into Angelo, Maxwell the barber, and Chris, and Joel, and all the confrontation, but it does end up okay. Barney, I think you had something to.
Yeah, I like the way that Ken, that you pointed out how Walt comes in. First of all, everyone in Sicily is so fantastic. They have such a wealth of experience and knowledge, and they're well read. And yeah, but to take this vehicle that people, especially at this time in the early 90s, are a little bit familiar with these chain letters. Maybe a number of people who'd watched the show at that time maybe have had one or run into one or heard a story of one, and then kind of a little bit later than that, there were email forwards that we would get from our friends or this or that, and occasionally one of those emails would be this kind of good luck, bad luck thing, forward this to 10 people that you know. But then to take this kind of relatively everyday thing that's really mundane and people would look at it and go, meh, and then connect this philosophical idea to it, and then just to help us to know that this is what the show is getting at, they bring Walt in to really summarize, to get the point across. This is a lot deeper than just a letter. There's a lot to think about in the way that we would approach this idea of a letter coming to us in this way, proclaiming to be able to do these things. And then it's so neat that the choice that she decides on when Holling is, disappointed that their reservations fell through, to just try it anyway, and then to make that connection with Maggie too, and her decision to run for mayor, and to go forward too. But to kind of go back a little bit, because I want to get this in before I forget about it. We see, and then I don't know if this is reading too much into it, but Jacob, you have met Maggie's mom one time in the episode where Maggie's house burned down, and even 15-year-old Maggie wanting to have a career and be a lawyer instead of choosing her mom's path of being a good wife living a country club lifestyle and, going to, doing all this charity work. That right there is a little bit of rebellion on Maggie's part. And then 30-year-old Maggie is rebelling as well by being the bush pilot and living in Alaska and doing what she wants to do. And then we see 45-year-old, potentially 45-year-old Maggie is going into the same circle of life, cycle of life that we all go through, where eventually we become our parents and we realize, oh, our parents really did know best for us. And, we admit that. And now she's striving for a position of power in the city and influence like what her dad had. Maybe
Mm.
at this time, unintentionally, who knows? But, I don't know if this is what they thought about, but when we were talking about this, I thought, oh, wow, this is really kind of touching on every stage of life that we have as we, get older and then into middle age. But yeah, I like that. But then the letter and Shelley going through with that is great. And then finally, maybe to touch on Joel a little bit, him trying to, I like the part where he doesn't know what the results of his biopsy will be, and he takes Chris's bike and he, doesn't wear a helmet and he throws all caution into the wind, and then he gets back to the office and the results had been there and Marilyn knew. And then he starts to complain a little bit, and then he checks himself when he says, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And then Marilyn just has this good reaction,
Great
and then
line.
he gets it. He realizes why she didn't tell him.
It's in the box. So matter of factly, I'm sorry, viewers, I can't do Marilyn. Watch this program because she is priceless.
She does so much with the lines that she has. Boy, they're always
Then right
delivered
back to
perfect.
her crocheting. Come on, Joel. Oh, makes me laugh.
Yeah, but she realized that he needed that. He needed that time of throwing all caution into the wind.
Exactly. Hmm. Well, should we talk about Angelo and how he fit into this whole episode
Yeah,
for our viewers? Angelo is a barber, but I'll let you gentlemen take it from there.
yeah, he was a really fun. He was such a good actor. Really fun story that they gave him too, where he's just a little bit anxious because of all of all of the hard lives that barbers in general have had. Where he mentions, they've seen more killings than more witness protection, more barbers are in witness protection than
Well, barber protection. He was the
barber
first in the
protection.
barber protection program.
Right. And he's so wary of Chris, not sure what Chris is up to, because Chris is just being his friendly self, but it's hard to, being so new into the community and it's hard to know, but they eventually, are able to Chris is able to realize how, oh wow, maybe that song by Cream, I almost got my haircut, so many people who suffered as a barber in the 60s because people stopped getting haircuts, and they come to an understanding at the end there. But it was fun. That what part was really fun.
Yep. Well, as a person of a certain age, I must admit, that when Angelo was lamenting the long hairs and it all started with the infiltration from the little island over there across the Atlantic, and as I was a budding long hair in those days and all the conflict at home and trying to be a rebel that way, I had some real sympathy watching this episode for the barbers of the world because they had to have been suffering in those days from us, you know, not using their services. But boy, Angela certainly carried the baggage of that a long time, right into the '90s, and he's still lamenting and angry, and but, of course, as Barney, you pointed out, he saw some terrible things too, and there's the scene where Chris comes into the shop late at night, and and right away, Angelo's got a rifle trained on him, and just ripped into his lower leg and knocked him to the floor because he has come to the knowledge through Ed spilling a bit that Chris had a criminal background for armed robbery. So Angelo immediately figures that he's gonna do something evil there. But that seemed to be the beginning of the healing for them in a small way. Crazy.
It's interesting how, and I don't know how this relates to the bigger arc of the episode, but how there's a lot of judgment going on between individuals towards others. So there's Joel when he goes in to get his hair cut, and Angelo finds s- the growth or
Oh,
the, I don't know if it's a cyst or what it's called, that's on Joel's head, and then he quickly says some technical medical jargon. Angelo does, the barber, about what he thinks it might be, and Joel is like offended by this because Joel thinks that a barber should have no business making any medical, you know, assumptions or anything. But Angelo is quite astute, and Joel is kind of he's so swept up in his sense of self-importance as a doctor, and this happens over and over again. I think it's like one of the tropes or common themes of his character in the show, that he can't see the wisdom of others because of his medical training. Like he just it gets in the way. But there's his judgment towards Angelo. Then there's Angelo's judgment towards Chris, and
mm,
then there's Maggie's younger self's judgment towards her older self. I mean, there are misconceptions throughout the episode, and then as things progress, these are resolved as these individuals involved see the wisdom that others have and kind of take enough time to listen and learn and realize that there's more to the story. So I don't know. I like that about the episode, that it's maybe challenging us or anybody who has a quick assumption about, oh, this other person can't know or can't be right or they're clearly wrong, to take a little bit more time to consider that.
mhm.
I don't know. That was one thing that jumped out to me.
And if I can interject, Jacob, because it came to mind when you were talking about Angelo, saying that's a meningeal
Mm.
situation, and Joel later complaining to Marilyn about the very same thing, and just another classic Marilyn moment. He knows heads. Doesn't exactly shut Joel up, but that was the decisive comment. But yeah, the judgment thing was clear and present. Boy.
Mm.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, Joel's sense of, like, when he goes to see that other doctor to get the sample analyzed or to get more information, and then he hears the other doctor's credentials, and the other doctor is quite, how do I say, he's from a prestigious institution. He's going to go into a high power residency. He went through school quickly. Joel's like, wow, like I really respect this guy. He has a certain openness to, like, degrees, and like but he's kind of slower to, like, give people in with a common life experience similar respect. It takes him longer to, I don't know what that is about. I mean, maybe all of us struggle with that in different levels. Like we have areas where we will recognize authority or knowledge, but then there are other areas where we're more reticent to do so until we learn more. And I don't know, it just feels like Angelo really was helpful to Joel, and he kind of benefits from it in the end, but at first he's just too proud, or I don't know what the term would be to see it, but
And I imagine you guys caught the little jab at Joel in that scene with Dr. Rojas, where Dr. Rojas was paying his dues for having his education paid for, and I've heard where people sometimes end up 3, 4, 5 years. Oh, and my signing bonus, Joel, just about to.
Oh, yeah, like, his life was everything Joel had hoped it could have been, he's in a big city in Alaska. His girlfriend, everything's fine there, no need to worry there, they're fine, and then eventually, once he pays his dues, to the state of Alaska, he has this great position waiting for him back home, and poor Joel is just feeling the screws being turned on him for everything that went wrong in his same program, but he really got the raw end of the deal.
Well, are there
Mm.
any other thoughts or questions or items that either of you would like to mention before we close our episode?
Yeah, this was a fun episode to look at from season 6, and of course we will go back again because I know that there's a lot of other ones to look at. Like the episode where Maggie and Joel go to Michigan, that's a fun one. And then I was saying too the episode where Maggie writes letters, more letter writing to, I think it's her old boyfriends, her dead boyfriends, when she turns 30 to kind of put the past behind her. So that would be another fun one. But today we looked at a fun season 6 one, but in the future, when we look at more Northern Exposure episodes, we'll be going back in time a bit, I think, just to catch up on some of the other good ones.
Sure. And I'll be curious whether we ever go forward then into season 6 with maybe not perhaps the most endearing work, and that'll be a hard road to follow, but yeah, all fun.
Well, we want to thank all of our listeners and viewers for joining us on this journey of our episode today. And we hope that you too, as you considered what we shared about this idea of letters and thinking about our past and where we are now, and even looking some into the future, that you yourself, as you think of your own life journey and your own trajectory, could appreciate growth and change and reflection, and at times even looking back in a way to help us look forward. And so until next time, goodbye.